The views and opinions expressed on America's Workforce Union podcast and its digital media channels are solely those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views and opinions of the producers or sponsors.
Welcome to the America's Workforce Radio Podcast, the flagship production of the American Workers Radio and Podcast Network, where organized labor and its never-ending fight to protect the rights of the American worker come first. Now, presented by LIUNA, Laborers International Union of North America. Here's your host, Ed Flash Ferens.
Screenwriters at the WGA ratify a 4-year contract. What happened to Samsung stock when 40,000 workers rallied over income inequality? And today on the show, the low-wage 20 companies and the Transportation Trades Department of the AFL-CIO. Welcome to the Monday, April 27th edition of America's Workforce, where we're available on at least 5 platforms, including YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. Sarah Anderson will be our featured guest on the show today. She's one of 2 guests, and she comes to us from the Institute for Policy Studies, where she serves as the Global Economy Director, ips-dc.org. You also can check out her writings at inequality.org. And we're going to talk about a new policy studies report that she authored looking at the 20 largest employers of low-wage workers. That's right. They found that 15 of these and other low-wage 20 companies have median pay below the $35,631 income limit for a family of 3 to qualify for Medicaid. Another 13 had median pay below the $33,576 family threshold for SNAP food benefits. All right? Meanwhile, the CEOs of these firms don't exactly have to worry about putting food on the table or paying their doctor's bills. The compensation, this goes back to 2024, averaged $18.6 million. Yeah, they're doing pretty good at the expense of the people that are working for them. So she's going to be our first guest. We're going to run down a couple of these companies, the low-wage 20. Then we're going to go to Greg Regan. Greg, longtime contributor to America's Workforce on behalf of the Transportation Trades Department of the AFL-CIO. First thing we're going to talk about, well, you probably heard me talk about this on the show last week because of the shortage for air traffic controllers in America. What the Department of Transportation and the FAA are doing, they're reaching out to video game players. If you like video games, you might be the next air traffic controller. And there's a YouTube video on that. We're also going to talk about the 20-plus unions that sent a letter to Congress urging lawmakers to expand the overtime tax deduction to millions more workers. This was contained in that so-called big, beautiful bill. Well, guess what? There's a lot of people that were not included. We're talking airline, rail, trucking, maritime. A lot of workers that actually have a lot of OT. They're not getting compensated for it. Well, at least not getting the tax deduction. Let's put it that way. Also, the rights for the TSA workforce. They want to pretty much restore collective bargaining rights, which the administration has taken away. And we're also going to talk about the Jones Act waiver. So lots to talk about with both of our guests right here on America's Workforce. Now, a brief look into the world of labor. This segment brought to you by Boyd Watterson Asset Management. You can find more at boydwatterson.com. On Friday, screenwriters represented by the Writers Guild of America, the WGA, voted to ratify a 4-year agreement with the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, the AMPTP. Now, the union represents more than 10,000 screenwriters in Hollywood and throughout the country. As we reported recently, the two reached a tentative agreement after about 3 weeks of talks. This is in stark contrast to what happened 3 years ago, where they had a 146-day-long strike. Now, over 90% of voting guild members voted to ratify the agreement. Key provisions include a total increase of $321 million to the union's health fund, as well as licensing requirements for companies looking to use writers' work to train a commercial generative AI system. Elsewhere in Hollywood, actors represented by my union, SAG-AFTRA, are currently negotiating a contract with the motion picture industry and the Directors Guild of America, and those talks actually kick off on May 11th. They're in the preliminary stage right now. In other contract ratification news, teachers represented by the United Teachers Los Angeles and the Association of Administrators of Los Angeles, Teamsters, they have ratified a new contract. Get this story. Semiconductor production at Samsung Electronics fell over 18% in a single day last week in South Korea. Why? It was all due to a rally attended by 40,000 unionized workers. The union is demanding that the company distribute 15% of its operating profit to its workers and abolish its cap on bonuses. Otherwise, it will begin an 18-day-long strike. Now, earlier this month, Samsung announced that its expected first quarter earnings would surpass its entire profit for last year. Now, the boom in profit is due in part to surging demand for semiconductors, which are a critical part of artificial intelligence. If the talks prove unsuccessful, an ensuing strike would cost the company over $700 million per day. Per day. That's why the stock fell by actually 18.4%. We'll see what happens on that one. I want to take a minute here to talk about the latest union-busting companies here, and this is a courtesy of our friend Bob Funk at the Labor Lab, laborlab.us. And this is interesting, too, because as we've been reporting here on the show, not all of these union busters are successful. How about Webasto Roof Systems out of Michigan? They hired Labor Consulting Group, $300 an hour. The workers won. Ground Effects out of Michigan hired Labor Consulting, $300 an hour. Election won. G Mechanical out of Ohio, also hiring, same group, Labor Management Consultants, $250 an hour. Election won. Now there was one lost here. Henry Brock Foods out of Illinois, they hired Santana International at $212.50 an hour. That election was lost. So thank you, Bob Funk and his team over at the Labor Lab. You know, our Workers' Memorial Day series continues today, and we're moving into the 1990s with a tragedy that proves the fight for workplace safety, well, it's never truly finished. Back in 1991, small town, North Carolina, 25 workers died in a fire at a plant that had gone 11 years without a single safety inspection. Can you believe that? The National Labor Office of Blue Cross and Blue Shield presents this segment. And I just want to remind you that Blue Cross and Blue Shield companies formed out of a need to provide affordable health care to teachers, loggers, and miners. And back in 1965, the Blues developed the National Labor Office to strengthen its commitment to organized labor. Blue Cross Blue Shield's National Labor Office remains focused on America's workers, advocating for affordable and equitable health care, partnering with strategic alliances to provide industry-leading products and services, and proudly serving more than 18 million unionized workers, retirees, and their families, all working hard for America's working families and for the health of America. You can learn more by following them at Blue Labor on LinkedIn and X, formerly known as Twitter. September 3rd, 1991, Hamlet, North Carolina. A hydraulic line failed at the Imperial Foods chicken processing plant, sparking a fire. 25 workers died. 54 more were injured. Most of them were women, most of them black. And when investigators arrived, they found something almost unbelievable. In 11 years of operation, that plant had never received a safety inspection. How about this? The exit doors were locked, just like Triangle Shirtwaist 80 years before. Workers had no way out. Well, the disaster exposed how badly OSHA was under-resourced and how entire industries, especially those employing low-wage workers of color, were effectively operating outside the reach of the law. North Carolina overhauled its labor regulations in the aftermath, and the workers at Hamlet paid for those reforms with their lives. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, the Institute for Policy Studies on the low-wage 20 companies in America. Back in a few minutes. You're listening to America's Workforce.
You're listening to America's Workforce with Ed Flash Ferens.
The Heat and Frost Insulators and Allied Workers are proud to be a title sponsor for America's Workforce Radio. The Insulators Union is leading the way in the mechanical insulation industry, fire stopping, and infectious disease control. Regarded as North America's energy conservation specialists, these professionals are known for their professional work and dedication. You can learn more about the Insulators Union at insulators.org. America's Workforce is presented by the Laborers International Union of North America. Feel the power right now at liuna.org. America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the Communication Workers of America. You can find more at cwa-union.org.
America's Workforce appreciates our sponsor, the Columbus Central Ohio Building and Construction Trades Council, who represents more than 18,000 workers from 19 affiliated local unions and district councils.
America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the United Steelworkers. You can find more at usw.org.
Now, back to America's Workforce. Here's Ed Flash Ferens.
And don't forget, you can check us out on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. That would be AWF Union Podcast, AWF Union Podcast. Let's go to our featured guest today. No stranger to America's Workforce. Had her on a number of times, and I'll tell you, you're really going to like, well, maybe not. Because what she has to say is not pretty. We're talking about inequality, the widening gap between the rich and poor. And it's important that we talk about this, so hopefully we can correct it in some shape or form. And this all has to do with America's 20 largest low-wage employers and the affordability crisis. Obviously, if you're making more money, you'll be able to afford housing, gasoline, groceries. Sarah Anderson, welcome back to America's Workforce. A little background before we get into this report on the Institute for Policy Studies and the website, which is part of that, inequality.org. I'm going to let you pick it up from there. Go ahead.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me on. As you explained, I am a co-editor of inequality.org, which is a website of the Institute for Policy Studies. And we put out a free weekly newsletter in case you'd like to get constant information about these trends and what people are doing to reverse inequality. And we tell a lot of inspiring stories about what workers and their advocates are doing across the country to combat this problem. And find it at inequality.org on our homepage to sign up.
So America's 20 largest low-wage employers. Can you run some of them down? We could take all 20 here for all that matters. This is a podcast. We have hardly any limits on this show, so go ahead.
Yeah, well, we decided to zero in on this group of companies. They are the 20 largest employers of low-wage U.S. workers, and they're all household names. You can imagine who's on there: Walmart, Amazon, Starbucks, Chipotle, Target, and so forth. And we decided it was a good time to zero in on these companies because there is this big debate on affordability. And as people are really struggling to pay for basic necessities like housing and food, and a lot of that conversation has been about how do we bring those prices down? And that is an important thing to look at. But as you just said, we wouldn't even have an affordability crisis right now if we hadn't had such a problem with wage suppression for so many decades. If wages had kept pace with rising productivity over the past 40 years, people wouldn't be having these problems affording these basic needs. And so we looked at companies that we think are some of the biggest contributors to this wage suppression problem behind the affordability crisis. And some overall findings are that at every one of these companies, median pay is far below what you need in terms of income to afford average rent for a two-bedroom apartment in the United States. At 15 of the companies, the median pay, so that's the middle wage, half of the companies make less than median pay. At 15 of them, that median wage is below the income limit to qualify for Medicaid for a family of three. And at 13 of them, it's below the limit to qualify for SNAP food aid. We think this is a really important issue because when companies can get away with shifting so much of their workers' basic costs onto taxpayers, it means we're really all subsidizing that. We're subsidizing these fat CEO paychecks at the top. We're subsidizing their private jets, their huge mansions, and all of the trappings of ultra wealth among these corporate executives.
When we talk about pay, what kind of numbers are we looking at here? You mentioned they qualify probably for Medicaid, for government services here, but where are we with the numbers right now, Sarah?
I mean, it might be good to give a specific example. Let's look at Walmart. They're our largest private sector employer in the United States with 1.6 million people. So they have a big impact in setting standards across the country. And median pay in 2024 at Walmart was about $29,000. On the CEO pay end, the guy made 27.4 million. So that was 930 times as much as their median pay. That median pay at Walmart is below the thresholds for both SNAP and Medicaid for a family of three. There were also a handful of state governments that disclose information about major employers and how many of their workers are on these public assistance programs. So, Nevada, it's the only state that reveals this data on Medicaid. And there, Walmart was the number one user of Medicaid. About 29% of their employees in Nevada are on Medicaid. And then there are four state governments that have revealed this kind of data on SNAP benefits. Walmart had over 10,000 employees on SNAP in those states. And the states are Colorado, Michigan, Massachusetts, and Illinois. These companies, in response to our report, they've been out there trying to argue that they are, worker paradises and that everything is perfectly fine with their workers. These figures really show the reality, which is that they have a poverty-based, poverty wage business model that is a major contributor to the affordability crisis.
Sarah, isn't this kind of a form of corporate welfare? I mean, if they're paying so low as far as wages to these workers have to rely on government assistance here, which is costing taxpayers. So in a way, we're kind of subsidizing Walmart because of this low pay, aren't we?
Absolutely. And there's so many myths out there about people who do have to rely on these assistance programs, saying that, they're just lazy and so forth. These people are getting up and working every day. The real leeches on the system are the people at the top of these corporations who benefit from this business model that's all about extracting wealth from those frontline workers who have such tough jobs. We all know that these are not easy jobs, and funneling that wealth up into the pockets of the executives and wealthy shareholders.
So in your estimation here, you got some numbers. You mentioned 29,000. I'm looking at maybe low 30s here. And this is the population that qualifies for government assistance. What should that number be? I mean, where's the breaking point where they would not have to rely on the government here? How much more would that be?
Yeah, well, there are different indicators out there for what would be a living wage. I think MIT has a calculator that sets it at about $46,000 for an individual family would be more. And that's another myth too. These companies like to say, oh, well, the jobs we're providing, they're mostly for like teenagers or, young single people. And you look at the data, and that's just not true. A huge share of these employees are single parents. So It would have to be substantially more. The figure we use for the income to afford average U.S. rent for a 2-bedroom apartment is more like $59,000 right now. And I think people know like housing prices have really been going through the roof.
Now, if that were to be the case, in a perfect world here, if we raise the wages to the point what you're talking about here, how would that affect their profit margins? And will the CEO have to give up some of his or her money here in order to make that happen, or what?
One huge scam related to CEO pay that we've been seeing in recent years is the massive spending on stock buybacks. This is when companies go and repurchase their own stock. And when they do that, it takes it off the market and artificially pumps up the value because there's less of it available. And they have been plowing so much money into stock buybacks to artificially inflate the value of their CEO pay because CEOs get most of their compensation in some form of stock-based pay. To put it into concrete numbers, look at Home Depot, which is one of the low-wage 20 companies. They have spent about $38 billion on stock buybacks over the past 6 years. That would have been enough to give every one of their 419,000 employees a $15,000 bonus every year for all of those years. So we are talking about massive money that they could be putting into raising worker pay or long-term investments that could be good for workers in the long term. And instead, they're using it for this financial maneuver to artificially inflate their share prices. It has nothing to do with corporate performance or how smart the CEO is. And so it's not that they don't have money to be raising up worker pay. It's their priorities. Their priorities are to further enrich people at the top at the expense of those really working those frontline jobs.
And that's why we have the huge gap here between the very, very wealthy and just about everybody else. I remember talking to you about that. You mentioned the Home Depot story. That was a really good conversation. We had that some months back. Now, wasn't that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that was something that did not exist so many years ago? Wasn't that like an act of Congress that said, hey, you can buy your own stock back and increase your pay? Wasn't it something like that?
It was considered a form of stock price manipulation and considered illegal until the Reagan era. Reagan came in and made so many changes that were anti-worker. He really jacked up the union busting with firing the air traffic controllers who were on strike. He also slashed the top marginal tax rate. And along with that whole, mentality that let's bend over backwards and do whatever we can to enrich the bosses and the elites. And, that's somehow going to trickle down to the rest of us. And part of that whole agenda was making these stock buybacks legal.
Yeah, it's all by design. Things are the way they are because of the people that we put in office, sadly. Sarah, I got a couple more questions. You know what I noticed about this? You mentioned Walmart, you mentioned Amazon, you mentioned Home Depot. These are all companies that don't have unions. That would make a big difference here. Let's talk more about that. Sarah Anderson, on behalf of the Institute for Policy Studies, where she serves as the Global Economy Director. Website you want to go to, she oversees the inequality.org website, inequality.org. That's the place you want to go, and you can read about America's 20 largest low-wage employers and the affordability crisis. Back in a few minutes, you're listening to America's Workforce.
This is America's Workforce. More shows available at awfradio.com.
It takes LiUNA to power North America with affordable energy. The men and women of LiUNA, the Laborers International Union of North America, have the skills needed to build and maintain oil, natural gas, nuclear, solar, and wind projects that are shaping America's energy future. From new energy tech to retrofitted facilities, LiUNA members do it all. Find out what it takes to be powered by LiUNA at liuna.org. That's liuna.org.
This segment of the show is brought to you by the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees Division of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. For more information, please visit bmwe.org.
American workers are sick of struggling to get by. It's time to get ahead. In the Teamsters Union, workers are winning industry-leading contracts, historically high wages, fully paid health care, and retirement benefits you can count on. Across the country, Teamsters fight alongside our brothers and sisters to secure a better life. It's what we've been doing and how we've been living for more than a century. When we fight, we win. Join us. Be a Teamster.
America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers. You can find more at ifpte.org. America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the Ironworkers. You can find more at ironworkers.org.
Now, back to Ed Flash Ferens with America's Workforce.
And don't forget, you can check us out on at least 5 platforms. That includes YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. And when you get an opportunity, here's what you do. Just sign up and receive our shows on a regular basis and give us a rating. Always appreciate those 5-star ratings, so please keep them coming. Sarah Anderson is our featured guest today, and she is author of a report by the Institute for Policy Studies, America's 20 Largest Low-Wage Employers and the Affordability Crisis. And this report took a look at the 20 largest employers of low-wage workers. We're talking the Walmarts, the Amazons of the world. And again, these are all businesses that have been fighting unions for years. I remember Walmart even shut a store. I think it was in Canada some years back, and they were trying to organize, and they said, well, we don't need this store anymore. I mean, this is how adamant. And look what's going on with Amazon. I mean, the workers at Staten Island tried years ago to, well, they had a successful campaign. They still don't have a first contract. They're throwing everything. The Teamsters are doing everything they can to organize Amazon, and they're fighting back. I mean, union busting is a big industry in America today. So that being said, and there's 2 things I want to talk about. The union component here on how unions lift all boats. And the other part of this is the minimum wage. The federal minimum wage. This is sickening, Sarah. The federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. And I'm sure you've been looking at various states. There's a lot of states. Now, states, because of what I just said, have taken upon themselves to raise it. I think Washington, California, they're up there. They're up there. And some cities have done the same thing. But isn't a big chunk of America still at $7.25 an hour, Sarah?
Yeah, there are a number of states, maybe around 20, that still have the federal minimum, and it's a joke, right? Nobody could survive on $7.25 an hour with today's cost of living, and we're dealing with a problem that's not just about people having too much money at the top, but it's about the power that gives them to block pro-worker reforms, like raising the federal minimum wage, like strengthening labor rights, so that companies like Amazon, and we also got to mention Starbucks, can't get away with using all of these intimidation tactics and other tricks to block workers who want to have a union from getting a first contract. At both of those companies, Amazon, you mentioned the Staten Island vote, that was 4 years ago. The first vote at a Starbucks store to unionize was 4 years ago. Since then, I think about 500, maybe 600 stores have voted to unionize, and those companies have just dug in their heels and refused to negotiate a first contract. And that's a major reason why you see so many of the biggest, most powerful corporations continuing to have this poverty wage business model.
And looking at the compensation of CEOs in these low-wage companies, talk about this crazy gap. We touched on this in the first segment. They average $18.6 million. $18.6 million. So that being said, I guess the Institute, obviously we know what the problem is. We got to figure out how to solve it, okay? And right now, this is kind of a do-nothing Congress. Everything is at a stalemate. What I'm reading, though, this possibility of raising taxes on companies that have this tremendous wage gap, is that being discussed right now, to your knowledge?
It's being more than discussed at the local and state level. We've had a tax like this in Portland, Oregon for about, I think, 6 years now at least, where companies that are operating in the city, so including Wells Fargo, because they have branches there, Walmart's, because they have stores there, if they have a gap between their CEO and worker pay that's more than 100 to 1, they pay a surtax on top of their local profits tax in Portland. This tax has been working out very well and generating revenue for social programs in Portland. San Francisco also has such a tax. And this year, in both San Francisco and Los Angeles, there are very vibrant campaigns to put this issue on the ballot, to increase it in San Francisco and to introduce a new one in Los Angeles. And there's a tremendous energy behind this because these states and cities are facing huge deficits because of the slashing of federal spending on various social programs that the Trump administration has been doing. So, very broad based union community campaigns behind putting these kinds of taxes on companies with large gaps between CEO and worker pay on the ballot this year in those two cities. There's also bills that have been introduced at the state level in Michigan and other places. So it's a thing that might have to, bubble up from the bottom, but there are also federal bills. Senator Sanders has one called the Tax Excessive CEO Pay Act. There's another one with a slightly different design that AOC and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse have. So, and across the board, people like this idea. Americans of whatever political stripe are tired of overpaid CEOs. So the polling all shows that this is enormously popular, even among Republicans and independents.
You mentioned the gap of 100 to 1. That's when the taxes would kick in. And it's my understanding, I know the AFL-CIO every year, they do a report on CEO pay. And it's a wonderful feature. You could even check your own job and see what your CEO is making and what you're making. And I want to say the number's been around 260, maybe 300 to 1 or something like. There's some companies that are in the thousands or something. I think Starbucks is in that category. But any reason for the 100 to 1? Is that just seem to be a safe figure right now or what?
I think most people view that as obscene and excessive. The examples we draw from history about what would be, people always ask me, well, what would be a reasonable ratio? Peter Drucker was considered the father of modern management theory. His books are taught in every business school, probably in the world. And he felt that once you get beyond 20 to 1, you are creating problems for the bottom line, because if you have such extreme gaps, it undermines employee morale, which boosts turnover rates and lower productivity. So strictly from a business point of view, he thought 20 to 1 should be a rule of thumb as a maximum. Even JP Morgan, the big banking world tycoon, also thought that 20 to 1 was a reasonable standard to try to stick to. So, at 100 to 1, we're being, very reasonable. And in fact, there's been really interesting polls that show that people think the gaps are outrageous. And when you ask them what they think the gaps between CEO and worker pay are, they think it's way smaller than it actually is. And when you ask them, well, what do you think would be the ideal? They generally say around 7 to 1.
Yeah, that's where the education part comes in, and people have to be educated on the issues here, and this is certainly one of them. What's baffling to me, and you're probably familiar with the big beautiful bill which passed last year, which is forcing, and that's in effect right now, forcing people off of Medicaid with work requirements and all that. And when you take a look at the bigger picture, you mentioned about how so many of these folks that are making $29,000, $30,000 are on government assistance, which is tantamount to corporate welfare. Don't you think that should be part of the campaign here in the halls of Congress, is saying, wait a minute, these CEOs at, Walmart, Amazon, Starbucks, they're making a whole lot of money, and they're using taxpayer money for healthcare, which is just not right. And you would think there would be some pushback on that. What are you hearing right now on that?
Very interestingly, I have read that the New Jersey governor, the new governor who was just elected, put it into her state budget proposal to address this issue of so many companies having employees that are having to rely on Medicaid, and actually putting a fee on those companies. And I think that's a really interesting approach because it puts the spotlight on the companies and their, responsibility to pay a living wage and not reaping this corporate welfare, as you put it. So that's a really interesting signal here, and we'll see what maneuvers others might take, because this is a catastrophe. They're expecting 7.5 million Americans to lose Medicaid, 4 million to lose some or all of their SNAP benefits as a result of these cuts under the One Big Beautiful bill. And the crazy thing is, a lot of this has to do with new work requirements tied to this assistance. And so you might assume, oh, well, the companies that Sarah's talking about at these low wage companies, they're going to easily meet those work requirements because they're working. But in reality, those projections of how many people are going to lose these benefits is based on the expectation that many low wage workers will lose benefits simply because of all the new red tape that they're going to pile on people. They're just trying to bury people in bureaucracy and setting up hurdles so that they fall off of these benefit programs, even though they actually qualify for them.
So amazing what's going on here. Well, Sarah, I thank you so much for your time. Sarah Anderson, on behalf of the Institute for Policy Studies, talking about America's 20 largest low-wage employers and the affordability crisis. If you go to inequality.org, you can check out the report. One more thing here before you go. This came out, I want to say, a couple of weeks ago. Getting traction right now, in your opinion? I appreciate you coming on the show. I would imagine there's got to be a huge media campaign. There's so much going on right now. I just hope we can cut through the clutter. But we have to make some inroads on this discussion here. What are you hearing so far?
Well, I would really encourage people to think about what they could do at the local and state level. We are pretty deadlocked at the federal level right now. It's good to do that education for the long term, but cities are stepping up and looking at innovative new ways to tackle these problems of inequality. And there are things that you can do at the state and city level. And there's so much hype about, if you try to increase taxes on corporations or the wealthy, they're all going to leave. And there's a lot of data showing this just hasn't been the case in places that have done it, like Massachusetts, where they introduced a millionaire surtax a number of years ago. All that bluster proved untrue, and they're raising a lot of money going into public education. I just really encourage people to get engaged in their own communities because there is a lot you can do.
Inequality.org. That's a good place to start. Sarah, always welcome here on America's Workforce. You keep up the great work there. We'll talk to you in the future, okay?
All right. Thanks a lot.
All right. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Greg Regan on behalf of the Transportation Trades Department of the AFL-CIO.
This is America's Workforce. More shows available at awfradio.com.
It takes LIUNA to build North America's infrastructure. From roads and bridges to schools and skyscrapers, the men and women of LIUNA, the Laborers International Union of North America, build the projects we depend on. From constructing the Freedom Tower on the site of the former World Trade Center to untangling Washington, D.C.'s congested interstate, LIUNA members do the work that matters. Find out what it takes to be built by LIUNA at liuna.org. That's liuna.org.
America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the Heat and Frost Insulators Labor Management Cooperative Trust. Find out more at insulators.org/LMCT.
America's Workforce is sponsored in part by Boyd Watterson Asset Management, LLC. Find out more about our investment solutions tailored to meet the needs of Taft-Hartley funds at boydwatterson.com.
There is unity and strength for workers.
We are the USW.
We are the USW.
The United Steelworkers.
The largest industrial union in North America.
We represent 850,000 members in the U.S., Canada, and the Caribbean.
We work in metals,
rubber,
chemicals,
paper,
oil refining,
atomic energy, and the service sector.
We are steelworkers, standing strong and fighting for what's right.
America's Workforce Radio is sponsored in part by the International Union of Painters and Allied Trades, District Council 6, representing painters, glazers, drywall finishers, and sign and display industry workers. They remind you that belonging to a union is your right as an American.
Now, back to Ed Flash Ferens with America's Workforce.
And remember, you can check us out on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. That would be AWF Union Podcast, AWF Union Podcast. This is the time of the month where we go to Greg Regan. Greg is president of the Transportation Trades Department of the AFL-CIO. Website is ttd.org. A lot of really, really good information for workers posted there. One thing I did not see there, and welcome back to the show, Greg, is a story we talked about. here on America's Workforce last night about the air traffic controller shortage, and I was reading about the FAA and our transportation department have started a new recruiting campaign. You know, there's a shortage of air traffic controllers, so they're targeting those with video game experience. You know, there's a lot of them out there. I just figured I have to talk to you about this and get your take on it. I guess this is whatever it takes. Is that where we are right now?
Yeah, I give them credit for creativity here. And, I guess if you're getting hired as an air traffic controller, you have to get hired before the age of 30. So if you're going to need to get a younger demographic, maybe the video gamers are where you should go. Who knows?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of them out there. Apparently, they created a YouTube video, and, there's a lot of people on YouTube. So we'll see what happens in the next couple of months. All right, let's talk about expanding overtime tax deductions. And apparently a number of unions, almost 24 unions, have sent a letter to Congress urging lawmakers to do just that, actually expand that deduction. What's at play here, Greg?
As part of that big bill, there was a provision in there that was going to prevent taxes on overtime. Except there's one problem, is it excluded a huge portion of the workforce who oftentimes do work overtime. And we're talking about basically everyone under the Railway Labor Act. You're talking about a lot of first responders. You're talking about nurses. Putting aside any of the merits of whether or not we should be taxing overtime or taxing tips or any of those proposals that the president has put out there to try to lure in the working class vote, regardless of the underlying policy, if they're going to do it, they should at least do it fairly, that every worker, every person who goes in there and works overtime actually benefits from this policy.
So there's a number of people excluded on this one. Well, were they just targeting the people that support the administration to protect them, or what? I don't understand what's going on here.
I think it's just stupid drafting, to be honest with you. I think they didn't realize, I think the people drafting the bill didn't realize how to write it in a way that would capture all working people. They wrote it in a quickest way they could, and I'm not sure if they were trying to necessarily exclude these people, or if they just, wanted to keep the costs down or whatever it is. The outcome was the fact that a lot of people do not benefit from this provision.
Yeah. And the tax code, and what we're speaking about here, allows most hourly workers, not all, to deduct up to $25,000 of qualified overtime compensation from their annual income. And right now, I'm looking. Airline, like you mentioned, airline, rail, trucking, maritime. A lot of these folks are working overtime. They don't get the benefits to that. All right, let's talk about the TSA Workforce Rights Act, the Transportation Security Administration. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of people here who've seen their collective bargaining agreements just torn up. So would this restore that? Explain the details here.
This is a bill that we've been fighting for a long time, even long before the attacks on federal employees that we've seen the last year and a half. The way TSA agents have been classified since the TSA was founded was, they basically are in a separate category of federal workers. When the Bush administration, after 9/11, when they created TSA, they purposely excluded any TSA workers from having collective bargaining rights or from having Title V rights. That changed under the Obama administration, and now they're trying to go backwards. And we've already seen the Trump administration try to cancel the collective bargaining agreement for TSOs, but that is in court right now and continuing to go through the court system. But this right here would, restore those rights, but also make sure that people have full Title V rights. That means access to the Merit Security Systems Protection Board, making sure that you're on the GS pay scale. You're not on a separate lower pay scale. So all these things that we treat other people within the Department of Homeland Security with full federal employee rights, except not the people who are keeping our skies safe.
And you think about this, these are the folks that were not getting paid in the fall. They weren't getting paid a couple of weeks ago. Many of them left their jobs. I would imagine, too, don't you think there's probably a shortage of these officers right now because of the conditions there?
Yeah. I mean, these people, I have a friend who works at FEMA, told me he's been out of work for like 100 days or furloughed for 100 days. And we're talking about federal emergency management. TSOs, they've been required to go to work, but they're under the same, they haven't been paid. They've been under shutdown 3 different times. And now this one is still going on. They're being paid out of, I don't know, some way they're figuring out how to pay them right now. But this is a completely unsustainable path. And it really is damaging to morale. We have studies that have shown, internal studies of federal agencies that morale is extremely low among TSOs. And one of the reasons is they get treated like dirt, and they don't have the same rights that other people have, and protections, and ability to fully benefit from a union.
Yeah, if they're protecting the public, they deserve a whole lot better than what they're getting right now. Very sad, very sad. One more here is the Jones Act. You and I have talked about this. It's something that goes back a long time, I guess, my gosh, like 100 years here. There's a waiver here, a 90-day waiver that's been extended. Why? What's going on here?
Well, this is all show. This is an idea to try to act like you're doing something to lower gas prices that you have skyrocketed through your foreign policy. And I mean, we all know what the real cause of high gas prices is right now, and it's what's happening in the Middle East. The Trump administration decided one way to try to lower gas prices is to waive the Jones Act, except that won't do anything to lower gas prices. You know, we're talking about a small amount of our oil shipments that would go from coast to coast. The actual data that I simply don't buy that it's decreased gas prices at all, and now they're just extending it. The Jones Act has long been a target for the right, and I think they just found an option to try to, an excuse to try to waive it and see how it goes.
Just to share a little information, I filled up my wife's SUV yesterday, $69.50, which is about $20 more than before the war in Iran. The bombing in Iran, about $20 more. Just think, and that's for 1 week. How about that?
I had the same experience yesterday filling up my car, where it was $20 more than it had been a month ago or so. This is an example of pooping your pants and changing your shirt. You're solving the wrong problem here. It's not even a problem you're trying to solve. You're making something up as a way to say you're actually doing something.
I like your analogy there, Greg. That's a good one. Greg Regan, on behalf of the Transportation Trades Department of the AFL-CIO, ttd.org. You take care, stay safe. We'll talk to you next month, okay?
All right. Thank you.
And that'll be it for another edition of America's Workforce. Tomorrow, the steelworkers and their fight at British Petroleum. Until then, all of you have a safe and wonderful day.
That concludes another episode of the America's Workforce Radio Podcast. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a show. America's Workforce is a production of Labor Tools and BMA Media Group. Find out more information online at labortools.com.